Hello everyone, today we talk about the strength of the early modern Ottoman armies, roughly between the beginning of the 16th and the mid-17th century, in detail, meaning essentially what we know from the top of the historiography available, and the general appreciation of, say, accuracy, say, also common sense to some extent. There is always the problem of numbers, right? That every military historian has to cope with. There is all a philosophy behind it. I often expose it in the videos about the battles. Actually, we make that's because we make a few of this kind, right? I think this is just the second. The other was the English army's strength of the 100 Years' War, right? Let's start from a couple of figures introductively from two of the most important battles of the beginning of the period. One is, let's not go in chronological order, Moach, 1526, illustrating essentially the typical idea that is correct. We just refined the general figures in a systemic explanation later of cavalry prevalence over infantry, right? There is this modern estimate that for the Ottoman force in Moach, as you know, against the Hungarians, provides with a fairly typical makeup. So we have for infantry 2,000 janissaries and 5,000 local levies. For the cavalry we have 7,000 sipais of the port. By the way, I made a video about the sipais of this period. If you're interested, you can check that out. There is a pretty hefty Ottoman warfare playlist you can browse. Then 10,000 Asiatic feudal sipais, 15,000 European feudal sipais. So this was the household feudal cavalry plus the Timariot feudal levies from Anatolia and Rumelia, respectively. And we think up to 20,000 akinces, which makes a substantial total of 24,000 plus essentially 39,000, almost 60,000, right? And we will look at this being actually a pretty large and yet accurate number for the Sultanial forces in major regional efforts. Another figure is the one of the clamorous Ottoman victory over the Persians in Mesopotamia, 1514, where the Ottomans are credited to have fielded, and this is instead excessive, 55,000 infantry and 85,000 cavalry. Right, so let's break down the numbers and let's, of course, also sober a little them up, right? For the record in general and literally, when you read in chronicles, narrative sources, especially in, say, the Eastern world, right, there is all history, even a normal stylistic habit of inflating numbers, not much for the sake of, again, propaganda intended at least in the sense of, we have to show that, we were so many more than the enemy. They could have, as you know, said differently by saying we were fewer, we won. Now, this is, generally speaking, a way to square up or round up numbers to just boast, substantial power in showing that this was an enormous thing, a big deal, because these peoples were sort of more habituated to these larger numbers, which, as you understand, and as we've seen countless times in medieval and modern warfare, were often inflated by lots of followers that technically were not even the regulars that would join in the Islamic world from very far away places, also for non-religious reasons for that matter. But the tradition of the Ghulams, of the Mamluks, the fact that when the Sultan called for the major expedition, there was really a lot of opportunity for many around the world, right? As we will see, things were much more delicate. Today we do not talk, by the way, about logistics. That is yet another very important side of the story. As we will see, the major Ottoman armies were counting several tens of thousands, and you understand what comes in terms of logistical stress, like need of supplies, and there is all a historiography about this, but I want to deal with it in another video, right? So let's go step by step. When we look at regional clashes, so the major field army that has to go out there besieging a major stronghold that fundamentally allows for the control on the local region, you have habitually an effort involving the entirety of the state, whichever it is. If we're talking the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mamluks, the Habsburgs, whomever, that at this point in the history of the art of war obliges you to field at least, say, in the scale of tens of thousands, but normally not a few, but some tens of thousands. We can say 40,000 for the Ottomans, as we will see now, and again, considering that this is an average figure, because when we count battles, like military historians say on the books that sell because they're cheaper and more affordable in general, focus just on the big battles, right? I am one of those people who had the thankless job of, say, self-imposed, by the way, so it's part of my own planned suffering, at a point to count all the known engagements in a particular regional context over, a couple of generations, a bit more. And you discover a lot of very, very, very interesting things. You really understand, just out of just habit of just some sense that comes from all the information and its critical analysis of how war was handled. I mean, you can properly feel the Clausewitzian bond between politics and war, to the point of, okay, why this military expedition at this point, and why this size, with which objective, with which general drive, right, and sense of commitment from the other side. So for the Ottomans here, I haven't done the same work. I, as research also in times in which we fortunately have less, but at the same time, it was also for the places more accessible information, right? And actually, for the Ottomans, the problem here is that there isn't too much information. Probably there is, but I'm not aware, actually, even just Turkish historiography having done anything dramatically innovative or, providing with an enormous amount of evidence. It's also true that the Ottomans did not produce, again, the same amount of sources that the West did. We technically know more about the Ottomans from Western sources than from their actual land, and this is a problem, of course, that prevents from understanding a lot. But say the 40,000, right, is kind of realistic, like of a major regional encounter in which, as we will see now, also the armies were chronically under strength on a regular basis. We talked about this a lot. For Western warfare, this appears, of course, to be pretty universal in every time and space. And in fact, we have direct evidence now, as we'll see now, for the Ottomans as well, right? And even 40,000 men is an enormous figure, right? It is real, they did it, but just remember what I always say, also for ancient or medieval warfare, you can rest assured that it really takes a miracle to have an army functionally employable in combat under a single command. So for it to be functional in the first place, that reaches 50,000, right? 30,000 for those times is sort of easier and more realistic, an enormous deal. Here we are in the Renaissance, and we are, of course, in the Ottoman Empire that has a pretty strong central power and financial capacities. But again, planning and resources, even for a 40,000 combatants expedition, means really a lot. Here we will not digress on the organic problem of how many of the people that we get from the sources are actual fighters and or field aides. Right, so that's a completely different topic, and generally speaking, here we talk about a fighting force. And 40,000 is really enormous. It's already, like, in many ways, the gold standard. Then there can be some peaks of even more, but we do not think that increasing the number there had anything to do with increasing the quality. Actually, it's always the other way around, and we will see how, again, these numbers were inflated for real, like on in the campaign, not much during the actual fighting, because there was some sort of scenographic beginning, which lots of people came from different parts of the Ottoman Empire and the surroundings to participate, almost as in a parade, to say, okay, let's make this defile of even, I don't know, like hopefully reaching like the highest level possible. But this is not a combat functional force, and eventually just a smaller part of this would be involved in the actual engagements, and over time, like it would deplete dramatically, even to half of its strength, through desertion, illness, casualties, and so on. So this is always to be borne in mind. Never think that the Renaissance was actually this explosion of military force availability, right? Renaissance armies were actually smaller than, say, the ones of the say the end of the 13th, of the early 14th century. This is especially true in the West, that had actually recompacted territorially somewhat at this point, but in fact had smaller armies than before. There is also the, say, logistical factor of artillery that was very heavy, and especially the Westerners made the sort of more, say, intense use of it per force deployed. But at this point, the West, look at the Ottomans, was mostly like on the defensive, at least in fact, against the Turks. They also mostly fought each other at sort of different ranges, right? Then with the Turk, it also had its own problem in terms of stretching his resources up to places like Vienna or Podolia. So there would be so much to tell. Here today we talk numbers, we do not talk actual operations, and that's why I have like a modern warfare playlist, like trying to balance out the content in that sense. But there is also a more average scale of operation, of campaign proper, that counts on essentially the provincial forces, and that can be in fact estimated in the range of 6,000 to 8,000 combatants on average, right? These guys are essentially local militia plus some professional corps and some extra help depending on where, mostly also in here, like Ottoman subjects slash allies slash auxiliaries of some sort. And the advantage of this scale of warfare is that can be undertaken through the initiative of the local rulers, that after all that the provincial ones were provided with this level of course, strategic autonomy by the same sultans. And this was kind of obvious because, as you know, the Ottoman Empire is in fact an empire, something still very different, but sort of not much a relic of the past per se, but it's run in sort of more archaic ways than we think compared to the West, right? It's very decentralized after all, and its society is also more backwards on average than the Western one. So it also needs this, in fact, quite measured in support within the same system, right? Assistance and so on, because it's not meant even to have that much initiative, and some forces must be assembled with the permission, of course, of the higher power, rather than just be found available locally. Because let's remember, the Ottomans do not have that punching, stopping power, tactically speaking, compared to the Westerners on average, right? They have lots of this sort of auxiliaries fighting still, like as steppe warriors, coming literally from there, as think about the Tartars and so on. And as we've seen, even the infantry element, that is the one you need literally to storm cities and make substantial stands in open field, and take on the more courageous formations of the Westerners. It's not quite there. So yes, there are lots of things you can do, as we've seen the two systems sort of counterbalance one another, but the local forces are not the sort of sturdy burghers militias that you could find in places like Germany, right? They are sort of more put together scrap forces from subjected peoples that are not even technically too happy to be under the Turkish heel in the first place, even though they actually signed for it, not to fall under the Habsburgs and the Pope. Otherwise, history would have gone in a very different way. Always remember that they opened the gates to the Turks, of course, when there weren't too many better options, but the idea was, okay, let's enjoy in part this level of decentralization, in spite of the fact that they were literally brought under very often also after bloody defeats and repression. But this is also a political and cultural issue you always must take into account, but today we talk about just how this was translated into the numerical sphere. Let's look at other figures, such as the force mobilized by Toygun Pasha, that was the Ottoman governor of Buda, speaking about some of the aforementioned people in the far northwest of the Ottoman frontier. All right. This force had been gathered to subdue the stronghold of Fulek, that is Filakovo, in 1554. This is a provincial force, right? And it is described by reliable contemporary sources consisting of only 3,000 of the provincial forces available by the governor, that again would be like in Buda. These forces were maintained with taxes, supplies, concentration, like the fortifications of the same Buda, and so on. Habitually, this force is enlarged by other 5,000, not more, we're told, so we can derive from the sources, from whom? County commanders and castellans in the nearby districts. Plus, I would say, some sort of adventurers that the Ottomans could always call with a whistle, and they would arrive pretty quickly for that kind of operation. Most of the latter troops were also just like skirmishers, explorers, scouts, looters. They were not even meant properly to stand their ground in open field. For that, like in this case, it's mostly like a siege. Of course, most of all armies at the time operated primarily revolving around the siege operation. So you carried out these expeditions to properly seize a stronghold, and then you had to be up to a fight because somebody would, say, hopefully for the stronghold at least, come in relief, trying to break the siege. But sometimes these sieges are also calculated exactly in ways that know that maybe there's not going to be too much of a resistance sometimes. This example is typical, at least of the typical size of an Ottoman provincial force in an operation of this kind. Naturally, along the frontier, you find, as we've seen in other videos about the Ottoman army organization, some troops that are, first of all, provided with an important degree of autonomy. They have some kind of, say, even seigneurial organization. They are always up to some sort of guerrilla or counter guerrilla, by the way, warfare. The frontier is by its nature mostly a raiding area, so there is all an art of also, and the Ottomans are very good at this, screening what's going on behind the frontier, also strategically speaking. Like when some turmoil broke out in Hungary, the Habsburgs would never know whether behind this agitations there was just like yet another maybe regional force coming to threaten some big, maybe Vienna herself, or maybe nothing, right? This was a bit what the same Ottoman style of warfare was about. A lot of screens of layers. We were talking about this for the Ottoman array recently, about medieval Ottoman tactics. Then there is the hard bulk, right? The Sultanial force, probably like in reserve at the end of this all. A lot of psychological warfare included, and the frontier violence is insane, right? It's something like on this border, like we know they normally skinned, roasted children alive. Like everybody was, pretty nice with one another habitually, but we're talking about people who knew how to carry out operations, and it's just the scale of it all that is limited, and mostly depending on whether the bigger Sultanial army can arrive from Constantinople. Then we have, in fact, these larger mobilizations. A figure can be the one of 1635 against Erevan and 1638 against Baghdad, led by Murad IV. We talked actually about his exploit in a video I made a couple of months ago about brutality from Ukraine to Mesopotamia. I think that was the title, and in fact we talked exactly about these expeditions as well. But remember, these are mobilizations as well, and we're told by the sources, let's skip, like, say, the criticism of the type of sources, that in excess there would be more than 100,000 troops, right? We know that, of course, the Ottoman army was not as big, right? This is a symbolic show of Ottoman might, but even if there actually were 100,000 troops, these forces would not remain very long in the field at all, right? Many times this was just to test the dedication of the Sultan's subjects, like making this big show off, even actually calling people from the other side of the empire, not too frequently, because as we will see now how, of course, the Ottoman armies relied mostly on what they had on the frontier, just in terms of communities, of political support, and of course, like the material one, logistics, etc. But that was aimed at intimidating the enemy. That is to say, like, we all know that we will not go at war with these many guys. But I show you what I can do if I want, in line of principle, how obedient my subjects really are. This is typical of Orientalism, right? Threatening, looking bigger than you are, like, testing this autocratic self-confidence, and very often actually hides, some sensible weaknesses. Never think that Goliath is stronger than David. As a matter of fact, the same biblical story reminds you that. Just yesterday we were talking about Titus Malleus Torquatus against the Gaul. That's the Roman version, except the Roman actually charges head down into hand-to-hand combat. This is not to say, of course, that the Ottomans were not a hell of a military, to say the least. There were, however, evident displays of weakness that do derive from political mistakes, from general unthoughtfulness, right, and unpreparedness. For example, for the war in Hungary, we can appreciate in 1594, after 2 decades of relative inactivity in the northern frontier, when in May-June the Habsburgs launched a determined attack against the Ottoman fortress of Esztergom, the Ottomans couldn't actually put together much of a force, right? The Austrian forces were even consistent, right? And the only reinforcements that the Ottomans could muster were 2,000 border guards and horse grazers, the Voynuk, from the inland southern frontier provinces of Smendire, that is Smederevo, and the Bosnians that, however, thought well to defect to the Habsburgs as soon as the latter's forces arrived. Right, this is an example of how, in the absence of a prolonged struggle, like every war is like this, like there is a level of preparedness that sort of is present from both sides to a different degree, especially in areas where there hasn't been war for a long time. So the entire system has not been oiled enough, at least that everybody knows how to make war in practice, and they do it. But it takes some time before restarting the whole machine. The Ottomans, however, managed to handle the situation successfully. Why? Because they call the aforementioned Tatars, that are always next door, especially like in Central Europe, and in August 1594, these steppes warriors appear, like from the bowels of the steppes, under the ruler Gazi Yeraihan II. At this point, the campaign revolves around the Habsburgic siege of Győr, that basically fails because of these relief force that saves the stronghold that remains in Turkish hands. Contemporary sources say that the Tatars were 100,000 men, and we can legitimately doubt that that was the case. But the idea here is still that there were so many of them, especially as far as the Tatars are concerned. Like these steppe forces, remember always that they are like most of them are light. They're literally unarmored horsemen. Many of them are just like temporarily there. Like they do not have great commitment. They come here, as you understand, at the end of the campaign, after a lot of bargaining with the same Ottomans regarding the Tatar contribution to the war, and they are mostly there to loot, frankly. And the Ottomans may not be too happy of that, but of course it's just Hungary, so to an extent they don't give it much like about this. The Tatars are going to, make their mess a bit everywhere around, including to enemy territory, and that's pretty much it, right? An army of Tatars does not really threaten per se like an Ottoman. Like the Ottoman provincial forces there in proportion were much better, qualitatively speaking, and that's what the Habsburgs were mostly concerned of, right? But in this sense, the Ottomans could still get enough of what they needed for saving gear, and that's it, right? So again, warfare, as you know, is mostly all about this. It's doing things with extremely stretched resources, but still like always at the limit, and at the end of the day managing to tire the enemy down and making things finish often without enough, like the clamorous finale of some spectacular kind. All right. We're told, by the way, that these raiders, these lighter troops gathering from also the surroundings, again, also outside of the Ottoman Empire. Where does the Ottoman Empire end? That's a very interesting question, because there are peoples as far as Central Asia that are technically Ottoman subjects, right? What that means, is as irrelevant at that distance as it sounds, but still, it's there is a history of participation from those places. You cannot simply declassate to something strategically irrelevant. We saw recently how the medieval Ottoman army undergoes an important stepping up during especially the 40s of the 15th century, right? And that's probably the idea of the fiercely drilled Ottoman force, especially starting from the Janissaries, etc., is something that emerges as a statal army fundamentally, mostly from the fall of Constantinople onwards, from an otherwise pretty typically Turco-Anatolian, say, archaic military organization, right? Yes, some household troops, some mercenaries / auxiliaries, some Ghazi forces, and the more this power grows, however, the larger in absolute terms the numbers of the raiders still available, especially from the Eastern world, broadly meant, until the end of the Middle Ages. In fact, as late as the reign of Mehmed II, the Conqueror. He ruled from 1451 to 1481, like the guy who got Constantinople, the Golden Apple itself. These forces numbered as many as 50,000 apparently, which doesn't mean that they actually were. And again, this is the kind of figure that is more exaggerated of the whole. Also because the same Ottomans couldn't exactly count how many of these guys normally arrived, because they didn't depend on them. Technically, they were not part of their regular military. They didn't have roles, or, as we will see, like probably the sources, especially in the modern age when things become a bit more regular in general, because also the steppe does change. It's also conquered, for example, by the Russians. That's an important aspect of the story. In the East, also we have like some sounder powers that stabilized along the Caucasus. So yes, there is it's a different world, right? We know, however, that still as early as the 17th century, the high-ranking Ottoman bureaucrat Koçu Bey, living in the first half of the 17th century, the raiders were still a thing in the Ottoman armies. There are, of course, greater chances of finding them on the eastern frontier, because really the West with pike and shot has literally taken out the steppe by this point. And so also the Ottoman army is developing in a direction that doesn't need this brigands fundamentally just to be thrown out there to loot. They can be still used in that function, but they are basically useless without the stronger core, right? Terrorizing, depressing. We have seen it well in the series about the siege of Vienna 1683, right? The Tatars arrive and they make a mess because the Ottoman Sultanial force is enormous, right? And so there is a general disgregation also of the Habsburgic defenses, around the city. The same imperial family is almost captured by the Tatars, had changed from the Middle Ages. Zarain Aga, that is a commander of the Ottoman army, describes the mobilization he was entrusted with for the siege of Baghdad in 1638. And according to this source, the Ottomans fielded for this campaign quite precise numbers. It says 108,589 men, composed of, quote, 35,000 infantry, in part janissaries, and 73,589 light cavalry. All right. So this tells you the disproportion before cavalry, that is a huge number. Again, we can be fairly sure that this force was not actually, again, they weren't irregulars. Here we get the specifics that this over 70,000 horsemen were light. So they don't even say, well, it's a general cavalry force. No, that they're literally like all these kind of lighter troops that, yes, are so many, but how consistent are they, right? Is this like 108,000 troops like a single strong army, or is it simply this 35,000 infantry, only a part of which are janissaries, so the actual regulars of a modern state, and all the rest is basically some clouds of, again, steppes horsemen roaming around, looting, not even being particularly convinced to be out there, right? Consider this is a big campaign, so this is for the siege of Baghdad, that is actually successful, and that is in fact one of the most glorious Ottoman enterprises of the time. And so you may expect such a large number of complementary force, but you may have had also lots of field aids, of troops in general, so men that were not necessarily even fighting force per se. Now, we will see at some point even the sieges, these battles, because modern warfare is really fascinating. The Venetian diplomat Alvise Contarini states that in case of need, the Sultan could put into the field an army of 200,000 horsemen without spending a penny of the treasury's money. We're in 1640, and this is also a gross exaggeration, but the point of the ambassador was the highlighting, but what we're essentially stressing ourselves right now, that is, yes, these are enormous forces that, of course, even just because they are fielded, of course they're not 200,000 for real, but they can be so many, innumerable, as a matter of fact, because the Ottomans can simply call all this sea tide of raiders from God knows where, and causing amok, right? Chaos, like making things difficult, of course, for the Ottoman enemies that maybe are not even threatened by a cohesive force, but in the mass, they can't quite operate with all these presence around, and having problems, especially as heavier armies that rely on some sounder logistics that can be, the supply lines of which can be tormented, harassed by these light horsemen, like, can really be a problem, right? But let's not think, again, you hear this number and say, oh my god, the Ottoman armies were 100,000 men, or 200,000. No, all right? In any case, the quality is much lower than the best forces that the same Ottomans could field as a true army, the Janissaries, right? Plus the Sipais, and there is no doubt about that too, so that, as we'll see now, the Ottoman armies were consistent, were really about a sound core that was a problem for any enemy, the most robust one even. This is a side dish that just facilitates, in fact, also the pretty difficult tasks of the Ottomans. Think about this even geographically speaking. This is an empire that stretches from Hungary to the Persian Gulf, from Ukraine to Sudan. Like the deterrent force needed to control all this territory, even just politically, not through direct occupation, right, is possible only if you can bring such an enormous amount of force at very long distance from Constantinople, that lays pretty much in the center of this. Also, Rumelia and Anatolia are the true actual empire, geographically speaking. The rest is also just different layers of decentralization of some sort. And very often the Ottomans are essentially at war on three fronts simultaneously. So you actually even have to wonder how long this empire managed to keep itself together given this enormous strains and the vastity of the enterprise. Of course, there were political and, say, social dynamics that would make it happen. But the idea was that you could even just call those horsemen, again, as the Venetian diplomat says, without spending a penny of the treasury's money, because if you were able to concentrate a mass of men with this logistical challenges, you could plunder across vast areas, reaching up to Vienna, besieging it. Technically, the Ottomans, even in 1683, I often remind it, had even Warsaw as an option, right? The Vistula, and just the Danube. And you do need an enormous screen of forces that have to forage for your own army, have to lay waste, have to just create like a protection all around for the nucleus. That is very heavy. That is very tough. Like, has a hell of artillery, for example. It does have very high military quality. By the way, the myth that the Ottoman army was sort of just inferior to the Westerners, especially because of a technological reason, is not quite there. We know it pretty well after the Battle of the Raab. That is the anecdote of the Field Marshal Montecuccoli seizing the Ottoman camp and having an eye for gunpowder. He examines the barrels and says that the Turkish powder was actually of the finest level, and if he said that, we can't trust him for sure. So again, it's a lot of things. That's why I would like to attach the part on logistics as well, because that dimensions better the utterly insane force and the actual success that is even more mind-blowing, really, of the Ottoman armies to project their strategic force like so far away, after all, from their regional basis of power. So this 200,000 is an excess. There is, however, a parallel that can be done by scale as far as the reservoir of potential for mobilizable Timarios is concerned. This is also possibly what Contarini was referring to. It's not just these sort of scumbags from the steppes that can always arrive plundering, raping, and so on. It's mostly about the fact that the actual backbone of the Ottoman army itself is provided by the Timariot forces. Right? Without these, not even the Janissaries could have operated in the first place. And given that it was a sort of feudal system, albeit not so dynastic, like the Ottoman state retained a greater control on the Timar, right, compared to, say, what, I don't know, the French king would do for the the peers of France and their mini states within the same France. This force was still largely regarded with, in fact, a medieval sort of proceeding, right? And these people had just like a great privilege in receiving the Timar in the first place, and they owed this military service to the Sultan. And they were proud people. This was the actual aristocracy of the empire. They despised, by the way, as equestrians, the janissaries that were just foot slaves and represented also the tyrannic force of the Sultan that oppressed the sort of free noblemen, right? Men at arms, knights, and yet the system worked pretty well. So thanks to this conflict, to this sort of back and forth between janissary and Timariot power. However, this is an exercise you can make also for older times. For example, for the High Middle Ages, we do have the actual figures of how many knights could be recruited across every Western monarchy, right? And we're talking about sometimes even some thousand knights. Does this mean that, say, in the 12th century, I don't know, Sicily, England, Germany could actually levy that? No, right? It would have required an enormous effort that you would have had to justify politically and socially in a way that you simply couldn't, right? You didn't have the reason to. Here we are in the modern age. There is a bit more of, central power at work, but you also have to consider what you can squeeze out of these communities, and also what is the actual quantity ratio that you want to look at, also in terms of cost effectiveness. One. So it's fair to say that there was hardly ever more than 70,000 Timariots available for mobilization. Zarain Aga stated this at some point, and this was just like a top figure, 73,000, right? And these forces were not just light, there were also light cavalrymen among them, because they weren't just the men at arms, there are the retinues as well, and the aforementioned figure actually is not exclusive of the Timariots either. In fact, for the aforementioned campaign, you have to consider Kurdish and Turkmen chieftains siding with the Ottoman force. So we're talking about, of course, the regions that were closer to the active front and on which the same Ottoman force relied the most logistically in terms of supplies. That's where they were foraging from, essentially, which tells you that, of course, of these 70,000, you have, of course, just a part, right, a substantial one of Timariots, of which, like the troops were mounted mostly, but would have been light as well, especially, say, the Anatolian Timars provided with lighter cavalry. This is on average compared to the Romanian one. And so we're talking about a lighter weight, right? If you say, I don't know, 10,000 cavalry in the West at this point is very heavy. Like, you can have, like, you have the men at arms, it's sort of pretty heavy forces next to them with also some important firepower. It's also a logistical burden that is considerably higher on average than the one of the Ottoman numbers, right? So that's how things essentially balance each other out. Like the Ottoman periphery and also the provinces were really plenty of sort of lighter sort of forces that represented a bit those sort of broken subjects. It's a bit like the steppes concept. Why are there all those light horse archers, and then there is a pretty good functional elite that is, however, limited in number? Because the elite has stripped essentially the subjects that of their wealth, and these are the same people who are in fact going to fight as lighter troops. And this is true a bit for the Ottoman world as well. There aren't main other centers of power except Constantinople with its Janissary force and the Rumelian and Anatolian Timariotes, right? The rest is, there are peoples that sometimes also rebel, there are a problem and whatever, but as a regional force, it's just the Ottomans, right? So consider the fluidity, how the difference that it makes, even just in terms of space covered, of what it means to, in fact, control this enormous territory, but how much is actually concentrated in there, right? And compared to, say, Europe, for example, that is extremely and overwhelmingly bulkier in comparison. And that's also a reason why the Ottomans had so much trouble, going west in the first place. When we look at the early 16th century, before the Ottoman conquest of Hungary in 1541, we know that the potential of the Timariote force was roughly 90,000 men. So this means on paper you could levy as many troops, which again, on paper, it means much less, overwhelmingly less at times. 60,000 of these forces were gathered from, again, either Rumelia or Anatolia. They could be mobilized as far as the Danubian frontier for this reason. Naturally, the Rumelian forces would have been privileged in this sense. Again, Rumelia was richer, right? Heavier, more populated, was sort of like the connections even in the Balkans and in Central Europe were better than in Anatolia. So there were also, for the mobilization, all this kind of strategical and logistical needs and dynamics. So in Suleiman's time we have a maximum of 90,000 Timariotes that can be recruited in different ways. 2/5 of them concentrate in Europe, right? And these are also the heavier forces on average. By the reign of Murad IV, we are in 1623, 1640, the total had increased a little bit, 106,000. So remaining fundamentally the same. And also for, again, the roof, like of mobilization power, 16,000 over, 100,000 is not this enormous change or deal. The Ottoman administration has expanded. There are ways to control better the provinces as well, but also the need for a more professional central force has actually arisen, with all the political consequences of the case as well. Again, the problem of the Janissaries, their political autonomy, and so on. This is a system continuously evolving, and also the military quality, the costs, right, are changing importantly. We know from this estimate that the Timariote potential in 1631 was 46,785 for Rumelia and 59,818 for Anatolia, for a total of 106,603. Right, and this doesn't mean that they would be mobilized in total, of course, nor that anybody would have sought for that. Also, because literally you would have, exhausted. Even if you could have done it, which was impossible, like you could still not count on anybody else at that point. Kochubey gives us perhaps more accurate assessment of what the actual Timariote strength was. We are again in the first half of the 17th century, and he puts it at approximately 70,000. So it's actually much less, right? Not a half, but something that you must consider also in this case as a roof. In Kochi Bey's opinion, the maximum achievable Timariote force that could be led by the same sultan in his own time was 30,000 Rumelians and 17,000 Western Anatolians. Right, so not even 50,000. However, there was a certain amount of troops that is estimated around 20,000 from the Ottoman easternmost provinces, which would make this count around 70,000. Right. This tells you that, of course, the Ottomans were pretty invested in exploiting their own manpower because they were under those constant threats and need of mobilization. This was a great problem for the army. These easternmost forces were levied again, even with like more of a question mark regarding their actual loyalty, like possibility of mobilizing and actual quality as well, right? So the Rumelians and the Anatolians, especially the Western Anatolians, were the most reliable forces, the ones that just could be commanded more easily from Constantinople itself. So when you talk about the smaller scale campaigns, we understand that things would have been on a regular basis smaller. We have seen other examples before. In the campaign led by the Grand Vizier Kara Mehmet Pasha against Yerevan, Armenia in 1616, we see actually only 16,846 Timar holders. This was not like a too small force after all. It's more provincial, but it does take on a bit the character of a regional expedition that still is contained, as we were saying in the beginning, around 40,000, right? Some say 50,000, but realistically, as we'll see now also with the chronically understrength issues, right, that's sort of more realistic. Consider that even if each Timariote had been accompanied in battle by, these are Timar holders, right? So you have to make the maths, and considering that these guys would have, like in this case, on average 2 armed retainers, which is ideal, you still would have had less than 50,000, right? So this was, again, a vizier carrying out this campaign. A sultan may have had like this roof of, say, realistically maximum 80,000 fighting force that would have still fallen, right, considerably during the operations. And it sort of, does give us an idea of a strong force, to say the least. Always bear in mind that, again, between Tatar skirmishers on the northern frontier and Kurdish and Turkmen allies in the eastern one, the lighter component may have even increased the number, but still also diluted the overall punching force, and still mostly with a supportive function, like for the burden of these, let's say, of the bulk, right? So at the beginning of the campaign, ideally, there was an almost ceremonial rite of showing all together, and you could have even reached the critical mass of 100,000, or at least almost there. But realistically now, we'll see that the numbers were even below the half of that, and the whole thing was just like an enormous display of power that was also a test politically for the empire's well-being, and the affirmation of loyalty by the sign of the subjects to the sultan, etc. But having a little to do with the actual army strength. Considering sources from the 1620s and the 1630s about the mobilization for a couple of sort of middle-sized campaigns, we realized that when the Janissaries in Constantinople counted around 30,000 men, we realized that of these, only something between 20 and 25,000 participated to the expeditions, which sort of makes sense, right? Also because, as we were pointing out, these Janissaries were truly like the regulars of the situation. So if you look at the numbers here involved in the campaign, you realize that this were literally the core of the Ottoman force, and it wasn't that distant from like the one that, say, the Europeans would have fielded, even though they weren't as heavy as well. So you realize the need for other forces, especially in the mobile element of the wings, the Sipais, that, as we noticed, were essentially stationed on the flanks of the Janissaries in battle. We have a roll call held in Hungary in 1541. This is the same moment of the siege of Buda, reflecting the actual deploying strength of the Ottoman regular forces participating in the campaign in the siege, which counted for 15,612 as present. This is interesting because we know, by the way, that 6,350 were Janissaries, 3,700 were Sipais. It's not even that the Sipais were more than the Janissaries in certain circumstances, while 1,650 were artillery personnel. This is really a very important section. So the remainder 1,400 men were actually field aides, right? So they weren't a fighting force either. This was an important campaign, and you realize that if you want to count more tens of thousands, you have to look at some other irregular force just supporting the army, as we've seen in the West, also some external aid, right? So the general pattern of evidence tells us that there is this harder core of regular forces, again the Janissaries, the Sipais, and some other permanent forces or semi-permanent forces, plus some other foreign auxiliary allied component, plus also the levies, telling the truth, because these would have still participated as non-Timarios, by the way, and that could be a provisional measure of emergency, especially in times of invasion, right? We know that the Janissaries would go on expanding numerically throughout the 17th century, reaching a peak of roughly 40,000, so we can imagine, again, their force increasing. As we were pointing out before, the Ottomans needed an ever more regular army, not just this crowd of differently assorted forces. Apart from a few occasions, such as the aforementioned reconquest of Baghdad by Murad IV in 1638, and Kara Mustafa Pasha's ill-fated attack on Vienna in 1683, the Janissaries' deployments would rarely, however, rise above 25,000. Right, the Janissary effectives, so actually fighting, say in the trenches during the siege of Vienna, would actually be a smaller part, right? Considering that they would decrease in number due to the, to the wearing out, the friction, perhaps to like less than half, like things like 50 full-strength companies, or 10,000 men, or at least the equivalent of those companies. So this has all a set of implications for which you realize that also the expendable manpower in a more regular, intensive way during the operations was normally much smaller than this broader bulk of forces. One thing, just as we were pointing out from the Janissary Organic, though, is that the Ottoman army wouldn't go shrinking, but actually increasing in size over this time, and the actual amalgamation, like the homogenization of the troops' quality, must be appreciated in this circumstance. Certain ways of, as we've seen, putting armies together were always the same old ones, but there was a greater uniformity and central control. For example, were we to assess, say, accurately the actual battle strength of an Ottoman army towards the end of the 17th century, say, against actually a formidable force like the alliance of the Holy League, the Sacra Ligua, right, would point at something around 65 to 70,000, right? At that point in history, like we're the second half of the 17th century, you do witness a proper army army size stepping up, right? The center of this is France, but generally speaking, the world has been changing. The state has become more robust, more centralized, and so such a huge one like the Ottoman one can afford to field these troops. It's just like insane. It's just an enormous effort. It's a lot, but it's also effective to some extent. You could look at, instead, the whole 17th century. So looking at the say half of what was mobilized on paper, something like 50,000 Timariots and 20,000 from the Sultan's permanent standing regiments as the highest figure realistically for the major regional campaign. Detachments in the theater were dispersed as well, necessarily, and especially the more you relied on these lighter troops. That is to say, like the bulk of your forces would have been left, say, behind, or at least in a rare area, and then these other forces would have been dispersed just to, like Amtemnet, to as raiders to spot whether an enemy that often against the Ottomans, especially in the east, was sort of more insidiously, again, lighter, and thus carrying out skirmishes, guerrilla tactics, and so on. So the Ottomans had to be quite careful, because often they would fight pretty far away again from their bases and the regional bases of power, and so they risk to be cut off had they not taken those precautions. And you can imagine also, again, during the campaign, how many of these forces would sort of melt away nowhere or another, and how heavy, again, all the logistics really was, how stretched, and what kind of gigantic effort like the Turks were able to pull off. It's really that's why you have to respect the Ottoman military. This point in history, especially. So when we look at Mustafa Ali's Store History, this was a chronicler talking about the Ottoman conquest of southern Georgia, right? So these are the Caucasian Wars of 1578-90, right? There would be also, of course, Ottoman forces of occupation, newly controlled fortresses that needed garrisons. this was an 80, like 100 kilometers long corridor between Yerevan and Domanizi. A pretty wide frontier, and it's been calculated that across it, more than 10,000 garrison troops were distributed. Consider this aspect as well, like forces that, no matter what, but had to remain into the fortresses, right? As the Sultanial army was operating nearby, because this was a frontier, so if things had gone ruinously wrong, these fortresses needed to be heavily garrisoned, and also just for patrolling, for securing like the theater of operations in the rear, for the aforementioned supply routes and everything. So it's of excruciating importance, especially in that tough Caucasian terrain. As far as the northern frontier, instead, the estimation of the number of garrison troops stationed in Hungary differ. It's been estimated that at the peak of the Ottoman involvement in the region, we are in the mid-16th century, the number of Ottoman garrison troops rose to something between 22,000 soldiers, right? Which is pretty consistent if you have an idea of the spaces, right? It's not exaggerated, but it's a thick force. In the 1640s, the Hungarian front had, as we've seen, remained pretty much quiet, at least relatively. There were always disturbances. We often covered them in the prelude to the siege of Vienna in our series about the 1683 affairs. And part of the reason is that the Ottomans were pretty involved in their wars with the Safavids of Iran, and especially they were about to engage fully into that traumatically shocking drainage of resources that the Cretan wars, the siege of Candia against the Venetians really were, that literally bled the Ottoman Empire white, right? It was insane at some point. The sultans stopped even properly paying the alms to the widows and the orphans, that, as you know, is a duty of Islam, one of the duties of Islam, that because of the resources, of the logistical strains, and that was the agency. Just to tell you how, like, even like a close theater, of course, novel things complicate everything a bit, but it was just like nothing less than, I think it's reductive into called Venetian resistance heroic in that circumstance. 20 years of siege without practically any chance, but literally giving this enormous shoulder hit internal bleeding to the empire that in fact in the following generations would suffer pretty heavy blows, so lose a lot of territory. In Hungary, more specifically, the Eyalet-i-Budin, so the Eyalet of Buda, it's like the territory stretched between Central Europe and the Balkans as well, like it were parts of Serbia, and this is not important right now, but in this area there were 8,000 janissaries supplied by the Sultan centrally, right? So not locally. This witnessing, after all, the importance that this frontier had in the moment in which the Ottomans, in fact, wanted to be sure their back to be covered, as they were heavily invested elsewhere, right? And this, the Eyalet-i-Budin was probably the center of Ottoman Hungary, where there were 4 provinces making up the Ottoman controlled country, right? But this one was the central one, the one controlling, and the most important center, the most important waterways and passages and so on, routes, like communication, etc. Right. So a just brief information about the supplies here. So it's been estimated that in 2 to 3 months of campaign, the transport of the barley for the animals and the wheat for the humans required for only a fraction of the army, consistent of its admittedly most privileged units, so the janissaries, read, required the transport equivalent of what could be carried by between 35 and 55,000 camels, which is a traumatically insane number, also because you had to carry the barley for the same camels that are not just, in fact, working for free. Again, this is like even just for the core of the Ottoman forces, of a, say, regional army, a field army. Do you understand why this is so shocking and how incredible it is that the Ottomans could field such enormous numbers of forces, regardless, again, of what all we said tactically wise, and all this was calibrated, of course, to the greatest bounds, right? Imagine hundreds of years of military tradition and experience, like know-how accumulated, giving us, in that historical, political, and cultural declension, such Ottoman host. According to other calculations, based on the ox-drawn cartload, the monthly provision to an army of, as we've seen, not likely, but possibly, at least not for a full military employment, of 90,000 men and 40,000 horses, and we've seen how the horses actually were the majority, so we are keeping it conservative because, say, the horse meaning the cavalry, we are keeping it conservatively regarding the, like, also the various exchange mounts and all this stuff, required 11,000 cartloads of food and fodder. And the horses, like, consumed, of course, more than people, as far as the volume, the mass property that you had to transport. And this is also forcing, as you know, the armies just to follow particular routes, like how do you allow the horses to drink if you do not, especially, I don't know, in the Middle East, go just in the cold season, when following the rivers, right? Because, like, this is something that you're forced to do. We've seen it in the video about the Mongol logistics, right? You know that you knew that only in that time of the year that enormous amount of horses could be brought in the first place, because they consume that much water. How do you, like, this was a problem in Europe in itself, that is not an arid climate, and so just imagine in places like the Middle East, or I don't know, when the Ottomans fought against Egypt, this kind of stuff. It's insane, and it really gives you an idea of how much effort was necessary even just to organize this whole thing, how these expeditions, of course, could not be improvised, and there had to be all an administration that knew exactly what to do in time. And given, say, the rhythms of Ottoman military activity, let's put it in this way, like, it was something well oiled, especially in the years of the greater expansion and conquest, etc., that in part would repay for the cost. But in general, like, and especially after this was organized, was settled, part of the population was disarmed and everything was sort of, say, everything. I mean, a consistent part of the same local forces were properly organized by the Ottomans themselves. So it's really that fascinating. Again, we can't just talk logistics today because it's a different thing. But obviously it's all one with the numbers, as you understand. And you must always think what was really behind all these war machines, because without that you can't understand even the politics, the history of the empire, like why certain campaigns were carried out, what they were thinking to gain from that, and how they saw their power, how they projected their own ecumenic rule ideally in this again enormous territory. And again, we, like, for modern history, we don't make videos about just the manual history of it. We just talk about warfare. But as I was saying in other videos, I'm planning to expand this to some degree, also to cover sort of more evenemential history. I still don't know exactly how to do it in a regular way, but I'll think of something. And I told you I had opted for some sort of manualistic modern history, but now I'm just I inserted actually something else in the cycle, but more about medieval warfare. But it's not a problem. We will keep coming back, of course, on Ottoman warfare, on modern warfare in general. So I'm glad we are actually expanding the playlists every once in a while. I say this because it feels towards the end like saying, oh my god, I made yet another one. And I like when the playlists are long and it looks like you're accessing some sort of library. And Schwerpunkt has this purpose. Let me check Ottoman warfare. Yes, it's okay. Ottoman Empire, 33 videos, which is not bad actually. Thought I had made less, but it's cool. It's not even too much, honestly, but I'm glad recently we managed to expand. And I don't know, I think it's coming up now nicely. Like modern warfare, much more. It surpassed 100 by a consistent degree, but yeah, it's never enough. It's never enough. Really. Yeah. Lots of nice stuff. Cool. I always get lots of views for this modern warfare content. I should admittedly make more. Yeah, I should definitely make more. There's too few after all, and I like modern warfare. There's nothing I can say against that. I wish I had made more already, especially about the 18th century. But we talk mostly about the 16th, the 17th, which is good because that's also not very much covered, and we have to do a lot. Unfortunately, I can make only one video a day. That's you know, let's try to beat the algorithm, and at least we can secure our position, our business, right? So that I can go on with ever greater motivation. It has never lacked, honestly, but let's say, thinking all the years I did this with few views, just right now I'm finally sort of getting more, and you know, that's always nice to see the followers increasing. Anyhow, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.